Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay and I wanted to welcome you to a brand new video tutorial. We're going to get into creating lightning, and this is going to be a lot of fun. We're going to use tyflow and do a lot of really interesting stuff. So I want to teach you how to create lightning effects using tyflow in 3ds Max. This is something that I actually put out privately to my Inner Circle email list a couple of months back. At least the concept, it was something that I put out exclusively to everyone on there, but I wanted to do something publicly as well now. Now, if you're not part of my Inner Circle email list, simply go to allanmckay.com/inside and you'll be able to sign up there. It's free. This is where I put out most of my content, and I regularly send out emails with all my latest videos, as well as tutorials, PDFs, scene assets, as well as email scripts, other things that I do, lots of stuff, and it's my way of rewarding those who invest back in themselves. So that being said, I'm going to jump over to doing this video tutorial. I hope this is something that you find valuable. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know what you think, as well as if you want to see other video tutorials around this topic. I'm happy to go even further in depth with it. Finally, I'd really like to ask a favor of you, and that is if you could subscribe to my channel. I'm going to be releasing new videos every Monday and Thursday every week moving forward. So this is a chance for you not to miss out on all the latest material we're going to be putting together. So officially Mondays and Thursdays I'll be putting out new videos on YouTube. Tuesdays I put out a new podcast every week, and then there's other platforms I'm putting out other things. So I wanted this to be something where I want to build a regular routine moving forward. So make sure to subscribe so that way you don't miss out, and it would mean the world to me, as this is something that I put out for free and I want to make it as valuable as possible to you. So I'm really excited for this. I hope you find this valuable, and I'll definitely be back with more tutorials soon. Let's dive in. Okay, so I have this ship here, and it's moving out of this barn, just flying away. So that's the basic animation. Now, what I want to do is I want to have it so that way it's creating electricity around the ship. So, in other words, all of these pillars around it, or these beams, I should say, when it comes close to them, it fires out electricity, kind of as if it's interacting. It's kind of emanating electricity, and it's just touching anything that comes near it. So we could do everything. We could do the floor, but I'm just going to do these beams. And the whole idea is that as it lifts up and as it flies off, it's going to come closer to these beams and leave the other ones behind. So that's the goal, okay? Now, to do this, we're going to use tyflow. And there's a lot of controls in here that are going to make this very easy to actually pull off. Now, as I mentioned before, I've created a few private tutorials on how to do this, just for everyone who's in my inner circles. If you want to sign up to that, I'll leave a link in the description. And so months ago, I put out a lot of videos around that, but this is the first time I put out anything publicly. Now, to get into this, I'm just going to disable this viewport here, just so we don't have to worry about it, because I'm going to cover it up. And let's just make our effects layer active, and we'll go to tyflow and drop a tyflow node in here. Make sure it's unhidden. Okay, so tyflow, drop it in, and let's load tyflow. Like so. I might actually make it a little bit more room. All right. So the general idea is that we'll just create a birth. I'm just hitting tab and typing in birth. Otherwise, you can just pull them from down here. Now, the whole idea is that we got our birth, and this will allow us to emit points all over the ship. Now, the whole idea is that we have points kind of appearing and disappearing randomly everywhere. And it's kind of like as if electricity is appearing and disappearing randomly all over the ship. And so I'm just waiting for this to autosave, but the whole idea is that we need to emit from an object. Now, the ship itself is actually a lot of objects that make up the entire ship. There's a lot that goes into this. So because of that, what I think we'll do is we have a proxy version I made. So it's going to hide the old ship. This is the proxy version. Now, all I did is I just created a more optimized version of the high-res ship, and it's mainly of just all the key parts that I think are necessary. Like, we don't really need those guys there. I can delete them if I needed to. But that's the general idea. So I'm going to work with this one here. I'm just going to click and add that ship in. I could name it a bit better, but it's fine. And now what I want is I'm just going to change this to per frame, and we'll just say like 5 particles, something like that. So exiting out of the isolation, you can kind of see that there's particles being created wherever this goes, all these dots. Now they're not locked to the object, so another thing we could do is a bind, or object bind I should say, put it below the position object, otherwise it's going to bind it before the position's actually assigned. And then we'll just choose our, oops, what am I doing? Object bind. We'll choose our proxy object. Now, you'll see that these points are actually locked to it. To make it a bit easier, I'm just going to click display, change this to ticks, and we'll make these green. Just clicking on that color, I'm going to make it green. And it's just so that way I can see this a little bit easier. So we can see we have all these points being created on the object. But like I said, I want them to kind of appear and disappear. So next, we'll add a delete operator. And again, move it down the bottom. And the delete operator will say event age. And we'll set this to be something like 5. And then we could randomize it by, I don't know, like 3, something like that. So they're going to live for 5 frames roughly, because that randomization. And then they're going to disappear. So you can see these points are appearing and disappearing, and it just means that it gets a chance to fire out a lightning bolt if there's something near it, otherwise it disappears again. Now, we do have a lot of geometry going on here. This barn model is, a lot of geometry, so I'm just going to turn these layers off. I'm only going to keep the foundation and the frame, and as you can see, a lot of geometry. I'm going to turn the walls off as well. Okay, so it just means that we've got this to focus on, which is a little bit easier than trying to worry about keeping inside the walls. Now, with this, we can see it's all dancing around. That's cool. Now, what I want to do next is I'm going to use a surface test. And the surface test allows me to add in all the geometry here. So I'm just going to freeze the ground. And if you don't know what freezing means, don't worry. All I'm doing really is I want to select just the key geometry here. Rather than selecting it all, I'm just going to choose the ones that are closest. Because when we look at the animation, the ship doesn't get that far away. It gets to about there. So let's just select the ones that it comes in contact with. I think they're the most important. And I'm going to click Add Selected, actually. So Add Selected is going to drop them all in. Now, to know that this is working, we should set up another event. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the delete and paste it in here. And this is going to create a new event. And I'm going to link this in here. And same thing, it's going to paste the ticks, but let's just change these to blue. So I haven't really done anything. I just created a new event, and they disappear after 5 frames of being in there anyway, but they're going to be blue. And this just means that we can now test to see if this is working. And right off the bat, it probably won't. Okay, it's more about setting up a range that makes a bit more sense for us. So if I were to drag this out to kind of get an idea of range, I'd probably want it to be about here, something like that. So if I were to look at the radius of this and say, well, if that's the kind of range that electricity needs to shoot to, which was 350, I should probably go into surface here, surface test, and it's on distance by default, which is fine. And I want to say if it's less than 350. So if the range between any of these objects is less than 350, we can already see they're turning blue. So this means that the ship in the beginning I'm just waiting for this to autosave again. I should have proxied the ship in or xrefed it in, make it a bit quicker. But as the ship comes close to the beams within 350 units, they're going to test true, and they're going to go into the second event. So as we can see here, it's kind of hard to see, but they are testing true. So that's a bit better. Okay, now the object bind isn't on there right now, so that means that they don't follow it. We could do that if we wanted to paste it in there as well, and that way they stick to the object. Okay, so at least now we've got a ship that lifts up and it detects if it's near any of these surfaces, which is already really great. Now, what I want to do is when it tests true, I want it to fire out a new particle that's going to actually go to where it detected. So to do that, I'm going to add in a spawn. So this is going to be the, we'll call this base particles because it's going to be on the base of the ship. Whereas these new ones, we're going to do a find target, and we're going to tell it to shoot out to those surfaces that we're talking about a minute ago. So I forget, can you select these? Select all. There we go. So that makes life a bit easier. So the surface test, select all. Let's go to find target and say add selected. And now it drops them all in there. And of course, we need to do a couple of things in here. One of the key things would be just to set up a distance for this as well, which is really important. So we've got a couple of things, control by time, control by velocity. I'm going to say control by time. And we don't need to worry about it testing true because we're not going to have it trigger anything. It's just going to move it or direct it over there. And we want to set, I guess, like the timing for it. So we could say over 2 frames, we give it some variation so that way it's a little bit offset. Now, as you can see, the particles are now triggering and detecting on the surface. Now we can set the distance to be a little less, like 350, and that way they're still relatively close to it. We could try even doing less, like 100. So at least now you can see that these particles are firing out. So when they move to the new event, they fire out something to connect to these surfaces. So that works out pretty well. Now, we can play around with this more, but I'd like to be able to see what we're actually doing. So as these particles shoot out, we should trigger more particles to be drawn out on its path. Now this is really important, okay? First we'll put the spawn below it, and let's also make sure that we have at least something in here. So I'm going to do a resample, and then link the spawn. So don't change any parameters in the spawn until you at least tell them to go into a new event. Otherwise, they're going to compound inside of the same event, which will cause problems. So we set the travel by distance, and now we can see that these particles are firing out. So if I turn resample off for a second, what you'll see is we have particles being drawn out, and we can refine that. So key thing is that we want to probably draw less particles, let's say like 2. Now you can start to see the gap going in between there. If I want to do 5, I could, because this resample actually will interpolate between them as well. So that's a way that if we wanted to, we could set like a lower threshold and actually have it insert particles in between it, which is kind of handy. And then we have the amounts. So I could set this to be 5 or something that has more of a gap, but then I could set the amounts to be finer as well. So there's definitely things we could play with here. Key thing is that I don't want it to be too extreme. We'll set like 1.5, and we'll give it a count of 10. I'll keep it on 10 for now. But the spawn by travel, this is something that, because we have the resample, we don't need to be too extreme. I want to keep it at 2 for now, which is a little extreme. But the whole idea is that as we have this ship flying up, it's firing out these other particles connecting to the surface that it detects. So that's pretty cool. So right now it looks a little bit silly, and that's because we don't really have any motion or anything that makes it behave like electricity. So we can actually add in a force, and I would put this below the find target, so it seeks it out, but then we're going to have some kind of electrical pattern underneath. And I'd imagine we're going to need to see what we're doing as we're doing this, but this is why we need so many particles, because we want to be able to see the pattern as it's moving around. So I'm going to put my frequency really low, and that means I'm using my hand right now, but it's basically going to create these like really wavy arcs, which is what we want. Same thing with the scale. I probably want to put that pretty low. And then with the strength, this is where we could really crank it. And the whole idea is that we can get something that kind of really displaces and moves around more. Now, we can set this to turb and give it more iterations, and that's just going to give us more of an interesting motion. Now, it looks weird, but when we break this up, it's going to, basically this is more the shift that's going to happen. With the second one though, this is where I want to have a lot of strength, but I also want to have this very high frequency, and I'm going to keep it probably a low scale. So I'm throwing those numbers in there, but it'll be a good starting point for what we're trying to do. So I'll keep resample off for now so it's a little bit quicker. The whole idea is just to kind of get something that's moving around quite a lot. I'm going to copy and paste this in here because this will probably demonstrate a bit better. Looks really crazy, but like I said, we want one that's more of a wavy arc, one that's like ultra high frequency, really frenetic. Turning frequency on, we get something a little bit more crazy. So I'm going to put a slow operator in, just dial this up a little bit. I'm just throwing something in just to kind of help tone this back a little. Now, let's play around with this a little bit. First of all, the turbulence strength, we don't need to be that crazy for the actual electric arcs that we're seeing here. So we could try to dial that back a little bit. I might make that a little bit lower. Keep that a bit low. But I mean, and the scale as well. I didn't mind the actual pattern. I might keep my iterations up as well. But I didn't, yeah, that's looking really good. I mean, I don't mind the pattern. It's just more about dialing it down a little bit so it's a little bit more easy to see. Now, the other thing is that these are living quite a long time. So I think that would be good to kind of borrow the same setup. I'm just going to paste it in here as well. And then in here. This one, though, I wouldn't mind it lasting a little bit longer. So, like, you know, let's just take a look first. But I think that's not bad. I mean, it gives us something. I do think that the pattern here, and again, you can play around with this. I do think the pattern here is a little nuts. I'm going to bring the scale back a little bit. And I'm just playing with the settings. Try 0.05. Either way, I think this is pretty cool. So it's just giving us something where, as it comes up, it's already creating these patterns as it moves around. Now, moving forward with this, I think the next step would be to actually be able to see what we're doing in terms of actually seeing splines. So I'm going to turn the display off on these dots, and instead I'm going to create a spline paths. And what this will do is it creates a real-time connection to a spline object. So we click create new, and the spline object will be a physical spline. So it means it's renderable, it means we can work with it. We want to use siblings, not trajectories. And that way it'll actually connect with these particles. So we can already see now we're getting actual splines being created. And you can see here the different types that we can create. So you can turn on substeps. None of that we really need to worry about right now, but I just want to point out like what that's doing. Okay, so now we already have some kind of electricity, which I think works pretty well. It just means we have something where it's detecting and firing them out. We could go back to our original surface test and bring this back a little bit, like 300, something like that. That way it's not going to be too ambitious. It's just connect to things that are close by. And I'm just going to the top view for a second. So the other thing is the ship's a little bit more to the side. I'm going to center this a little bit more. Now, as you can see, it kind of shoots out and it takes a couple of frames to do that. That's to do with our fine target. So there's a lot of stuff that we can actually change in here to get a lot more control. Couple of things that I think are really critical. We can bring this stuff here doesn't really matter too much because we're not actually sending it out to a new event, but we can set this to slow down as it gets close to the target. We can give it some fall off, things like that. The main thing is how long it takes, so we can make this instant. So 1 frame, and you'll see it will instantly fire it out, and you can see that it stops triggering after that amount. Whereas give it a longer time, it's going to actually take longer. So there's different things that we can do in here. So fall off, for instance, is the gradual range, and I guess now that we've centered it, it's a little bit more off. So we could raise it up a little bit, but if we bring this back down to 1, these are going to be instant. Basically, anything it comes in contact with, it's going to instantly fire it out. Or if we want, we can have that gradually over time transition over. So that's up to you what you want to do with that. Same thing with fall off if you want the there to be some decay between the distances. But for now, I'll keep that at 0. There's spread, which will randomize this, so that way it's not exactly hitting that target, but it's kind of more randomized in terms of the target's position. And other things you could do is like the normals. If you wanted to get in, like we won't worry, I don't think, about getting into this stuff right now, but we can get into a lot of different things here. So that's the general idea, to get something that's kind of, like I said, more interesting. And we have this is more the directionality. Okay, so depending on how we want to do it, this is going to really randomize how it connects. So depending on what you're going for, again, I would definitely play around with the frequencies here to kind of get this to feel a little bit more organic. But yeah, we can definitely do a lot of crazy stuff in here. The other thing to keep in mind is that you can up the samples, and you can also do substeps, and that's definitely going to help a lot when you're doing really over the top different patterns, things like that. So I'm not too concerned with this one. It's more to point out, like, it's going to help just kind of randomize everything, so it's not like a laser, it's not that calculated. But the main thing so like I said, I'm not too concerned here. Throw in the values that you want. But this here is what's going to drive a lot of the look overall. So I'll run a preview of this and we'll take a look, but that's the general idea. We're able to fire out some interesting patterns and get some interesting looks. If we want to control the frequency of this, I could just up the amount of points being birthed, and that way it's going to fire out a lot more. If we wanted to make this more ambitious in terms of what it detects, we could bring up the search radius, and that way it's going to test true a lot more frequently. So just as an example, I might do this but with less particles. But here you can see that it's now detecting with everything. So I'll run a preview and we can just check it out. I'm going to turn display off on all these particles. The only thing we need to see is the splines itself. So I'm not sure how smoothly this will play back, but that's the general gist. So we've got something that's got electricity firing everywhere. It looks really good. I like it. We can definitely improve on that, but that's the general feel. So one thing I think would be really cool with this would actually be that whenever electricity hits one of these points, and by the way, we could totally randomize this too. Like if you wanted to add speed in to vary the direction, stuff like that, like, you know, you've got complete control. So as one example here, I'll add speed. I'll set it to like 5, divergence to 180, and we'll turn the force off for a second. And that's still going to help randomize things quite a lot. So that way, rather than like firing out like too straight, it might actually fire out in different directions. So again, like you've got a lot of different controls with this sort of thing, but I just figured I'd mention, like, you know, it's not just forces, because this is instantaneous. So it's more about just controlling the initial direction. Okay. Finally, one or two more things I'll mention is with the spawn, if you wanted to speed this up a little bit, if it's a little too slow, we can set the step size to be a lot higher. And it means it's not going to be as dense, but it's probably going to be a heck of a lot quicker. And we're still doing the resample, which is going to refine it quite a lot. So that's what that's doing. And again, if we want to optimize it more, we just bring the count down, and it's going to get more and more broken, but that's the general way that you could help speed things up a bit. And then finally, just not firing as many of these, or setting this to not be as ambitious will actually speed it up, because that way it's not reaching out as far, so not as many spawning or firing out to a connection. So let's try 350. So that's the general idea. Now, like I said, I'm going to crank that up a bit more. That way these will fire out a lot more often. So going back to just like 1 for now, so it's a little bit quicker. One thing I think would be really cool would be to actually get some interaction with the beams. Because right now these are firing out, but they're not actually doing anything. So it touches it, but it doesn't actually do anything very interesting with it. So what we can do is, once these have spawned and hit their target, in other words in this group, we could then add another spawn. It's actually meant to be in here, but let's just do this. Again, link it up so that way particles go into the new event. And with this new event, you can either fire out one particle or multiple particles. The main thing is when they go into the new event, I'm going to do a speed. Just like before, I want to randomize this, so 180 degrees. And that way we're just kind of firing these out in a very sporadic, different kind of directions. We could randomize that if we want to. The main thing is the divergence to be 180. And what I'll do then... Well, actually, let's just look at this first. So we're going to fire out a particle, so that way all these, as you can see, are doing their thing. And that's cool. And what actually might be more interesting than that is instead, let's disconnect that, turn off the spawn. Let's instead go to find target. So when they reach their target, they'll trigger these new particles. So let's get that spawn, and we'll put it at the top. Again, important is to put it at the top, and we'll make it spawn like 5 particles, something like that. And then those particles are going to explode. So now we have particles being spawned whenever it connects with the surface. So the next step would be to kind of repeat what we've already done. We add another spawn, this one put down the bottom. Again, create another event. Really important, link it up because we're going to do exactly what we did before. We're going to spawn by distance, and this way we're getting some kind of interesting patterns happening. With this one, there's a few different ways we could do it, but I think the main thing would be, let's just try randomizing that. In fact, I'm just thinking I'm going to turn that off for a second, and let's just try a resample. I'm just curious to see how this would look. So we do a resample. I'm just going to try this out for a second, and then we'll do a spline paths, and we'll create a new one. Make it siblings, put it in here, and we'll get the force, copy, paste in there. I'm probably going to rejig this, but I'm just experimenting for a second because this might be a better way to do it. And I guess if we were to do it this way, maybe... Sorry, with spline paths, do trajectories to see what we get. So it's kind of interesting. We could definitely do some interesting stuff with that. I think I'll stick to what we're doing. So we'll put the spline path in here, and we'll put the turbulence in there. And we'll put the resample at the top. And at least then we'll get this kind of exploding as it does. Resample, change this, sorry, spline paths, change this to siblings. And we should give these all a lifespan. So I'm just going to make these not live as long because I want these to be more subtle. So we'll just set this to like 3 and paste it in here as well. So the whole idea is that now it will find the target and it'll spawn new particles. Those particles don't live very long. Should be 3 frames. Got some force on there. The speed doesn't need to be this extreme. We could do something a bit more subtle. It really depends on what we're going for. One thing I think would be interesting though is to go back to our object bind. Okay, so I'm going to create a new object bind. And we'll keep it at the top. I'm going to go into our surface test. Oops. Luckily I had nothing selected. So sorry, so we're going to say select all. And then let's go to our object bind and say add selected. So what this will do is now the particles look and find a beam. When it does, it fires out a particle to this beam, which generates lots of particles. And these, as soon as we say lock to surface and snap, will actually, or they should, adapt to the surface. So let's see, of course, duh, sorry. Okay, I just realized where I'm going wrong here. So now you can see that they're conforming to the surface. And let's say we want more arcs. All I need to do is go back to our spawn, and we can set this to be 10. We could randomize it. We could do whatever we want. And same thing with here. We could tell this to be more random. We could do whatever we want. And then the other thing is adding turbulence in at the head will be important as well. So I'm going to get that turbulence, paste it in here. And let's just crank this up a little bit more. So I'm going to say like 6, 5. So you can definitely play with this, but the whole idea is just to kind of get something where it's interacting with it, and you can definitely do a lot more. I just want to try something so we get some kind of relationship going. So at least now what's happening is these guys fire out a particle, and that kind of spreads over everything, which looks pretty cool. And we could do the same thing again without the object bind if we wanted to. I'm curious if I could just link it in here, if that would work. Otherwise I might need to put it back in the other thing. So the whole idea is kill the object bind here, and then these guys would actually explode. A couple of things I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to my spline path. I'm going to create a new one. I want to keep these separate. I just prefer that so I've got more control when it comes to rendering. Other thing I'll do is the spawn, I'm going to put it here and do travel distance, and then just randomize that a little. So the whole idea would just be that these guys do not conform to the surface, they actually explode out. And again, like there's lots of different stuff we could do to experiment here, but it's just if we want to get more of a kind of explosion of electricity when it hits something, that's kind of like how we could do it. I might go back in, set some divergence on the spawn here. I think that might help just kind of randomize it a little bit more. And lower the velocity. Actually, yeah, I'm going to increase the velocity. Okay, anyway, that's the general idea. So hopefully that makes sense. All we're doing is we're creating two sets of electricity being spawned, allowing us to get some pretty interesting stuff. Now, that's a little bit crazy, so what we can do is I'm going to lower the... actually, these are fine. I think I'm just going to go to my spawn here. I'm going to set this to be a little bit lower, but we'll also set it to only do it to a little less than half the amount. So 40% means that it's only occasionally, like every second one pretty much, is going to trigger that explosion. And it's definitely something you could play with. You could get our slow here, copy it, just throw it in here. Just something to kind of keep it a bit more subtle, because I feel like the explosions are a little too ambitious. And we could go further and add them to the ship as well, doing the exact same method, binding it to the surface of the ship, and that way it feels like there's electricity moving over the ship. I'm definitely going to do more on this. I just want to kind of touch base on something interesting and simple, but I'm definitely going to be doing more on the topic of getting electricity to do different things. There's a bunch of stuff I'm actually going to record right after this, or release soon, that goes into how to set up more intricate stuff that we can get the core at the base to actually stay attached to the ship, have it affect other particles, crowds, things like that. So there's lots of cool stuff that we'll get into. But in general, like, I think this works pretty well. I'm just going to set this up for final now. I'm just going to set this to per frame. We could test this 350, I think is fine. I think overall all this stuff's fine. There's not really too much I want to do. We could get a little bit more intricate with this stuff, but I think overall it's good. So I'll run a preview, and we can just check this out and kind of get a feel for how it's looking overall. But so far we have electricity firing out everywhere that goes near, and that explodes particles. It also, like electricity, it also has electricity run along the surface. So we get some really cool effects happening based on that. Again, hopefully this plays back smoothly, but you get the idea. I could definitely increase, I think, the amount. We could have like more electricity firing out. I like the way it explodes and everything else going on. So I think that overall this looks really cool. And yeah, it just means that as this flies around, it's got that kind of static stuff just reaching out to everything as it flies through. Obviously, if we got closer to the beams, we would see even more of it. But yeah, I think this is cool. You can see that as it gets closer over to the screen left, it starts to hit all the beams up here as well. So it continues to do that. So I think overall this turned out really good. So just to recap, like as it moves along here, it's going to new territory. As it does that, we can see it's firing out new electricity everywhere it goes. So this sort of thing is really cool. It gives us a lot of freedom to do some really interesting effects. And I thought like a ship would be an interesting one, but there's lots of different stuff. We're going to go all in on this topic, and I think there'll be a lot of really cool things we can do. So hopefully this helped and kind of gave you some clarity about how to work with this. In terms of rendering, I'm going to cover that a bit more in depth later, but these are all the splines we made. We made 3 of these spline shapes here. Now, these are all renderable. So in terms of like, how do I get them to render? You don't need to add any mesh or anything in here. They're renderable by default. So there are some controls for just like any spline, basically. So in terms of how it's treated, as well as the radius, if you want to make it ultra fine. You can add more size to it in case you're getting really close to it and you want to have it a little bit smoother around the edges. This is just like a real spline. Finally, you can put on a, like if you're using V-Ray, you can make a light material to actually make this actually emit light as a light source. So this is, I won't bother rendering, but this is how I set mine up. So it's just slightly off-white center, and then the edges are blue, and it looks great. And then the multiplier there, opacity, I had a slight fall off on there just to make it a bit more transparent because there's a lot going on. So it just kind of helps make it not too crazy. I did find direct illumination tends to crash V-Ray. I don't know why that is, but by doing this is awesome. So as long as you have GI on, these work great. So every single time it fires out a bolt of electricity, it actually creates a light. It'll actually illuminate everything, and you get all that for free because of the light material. So that's the general workflow, and it's very similar setup to what I demonstrated in my Inner Circle, but I thought I'd just do a public video. I'm going to cover this a little bit more. Okay, I hope you found that valuable and I hope you got a lot from it. Like I said before, if this is something that you found valuable and you'd like to see more of it, simply leave a comment below, even a simple yes, to let me know that this is something that you want to see more of. Now, at the same time, there's other tutorials I'm planning to put out. So like I said, every Monday and Thursday moving forward, I'm going to be putting out new training and new content all the time. So keep an eye out on my YouTube channel. If you can subscribe so you don't miss out, that would be even better. And I'd really appreciate it and be very grateful to you as well. So thank you again for watching, thank you for subscribing, and I hope to see you in the next video.